All right, we're going to get started now. All right. Let's see. What is stormwater runoff? Now, normally I'd ask you all to help me with this, but I'm going to start us off with this because I think it's an important concept, and I'm sure you'll have, you can go ahead and clear your raising hand function there if you haven't. If you want to share with your other attendees, other ideas that I don't share about any of these slides, feel free to do so. Municipal stormwater runoff is what we see coming over the land and into a stormwater system of some sort. You've got here a picture of a stormwater grate. That's more traditionally what we see. But there's lots of different ways that the stormwater and stormwater pollution and volumes can get into a stormwater system and end up out a pipe or some kind of conduit into our water bodies. So the concept of municipal stormwater runoff is typically what we're seeing: water running off impervious surfaces, existing streets and rooftops, driveways, sidewalks, parking lots, really the impervious cover and what's going over it. And what is on that impervious cover is what we're thinking about when we think about the municipal programs, such elements as oils and grease, materials from tires and brakes. Those are the kinds of things that we often are talking about when we're talking about controlling those pollutants. And as many of you probably have worked on this challenges with stormwater runoff in general and is increasingly appreciated, is that stormwater, it's not just the pollutants carried that are harming our water bodies, but it's also the volumes with which they are discharging into our water bodies and scouring the beds and the banks of those water bodies. The industrial program deals with water running off impervious areas in commercial and industrial areas where you might have more toxic contaminants. You might have any kind of oils and greases that are used in the industrial processes flowing into a conduit into our water body. So that in very general sense is what we might be thinking about in the industrial sense. And in the construction sense, oh, I'm seeing that someone only has a black screen. Can anyone else tell me if you're seeing my PowerPoint? Just raise your hand, I guess, if you're seeing the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, those are fine. Becky, I wonder if you could call the tech support person, Ryan, in the line up there so that we could, we're going to move ahead. There might be something, I'm sure there's something that he can do to help you get your screen to show the PowerPoint. So thanks for letting us know. But in the construction topic area, we're talking about water that's running across a site, and it may not be typically what we know of as impervious. It might not be paved, but we're talking about water that's carrying sediment and contaminants from a construction site. And oftentimes the sediment and the dirt might be hard pan and conveying it in that sense. So there's a lot of elements to this that we can get into as we go forward. But I think I just wanted to give people the gist of what we're talking about. And again, it's contaminants as well as volumes that are harming our waters that we have to think about. And if it seems that there's overlap among these categories, there certainly is, and we'll get into that as we go forward. Another important place and in some ways it's a distinction from the general recognition of the wastewater NPDES program, is that there's many, many places to engage in the stormwater program. My list here may seem overwhelming, and I think sometimes that's why any of you who are working on stormwater might feel overwhelmed. You not only have at the top, I'm going to stop for a second and just let everybody know one more time, if you're listening and you're on the line, it would be really helpful for you to either do *6 or mute your line, because I'm hearing some background noise. We really need folks on the phone line to mute the line.
They are not journalists, but still there is that element of the scouring
I'm not sure what we're hearing, but if everybody, Ryan, do you suppose you could mute everybody's line for us?
Sure, it is the idea, but I call it the Boretization of our culture.
I think that I'm not sure what's going on, but hopefully Ryan will be able to step in, and I'll just try to talk over that person for now. The Clean Water Act is the beginning.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6. All guests have been unmuted.
Oops. I think we need to mute all the guests again, Ryan. Thanks.
Gayle, go ahead and unmute yourself when the mute happens.
Oh, sorry.
All guests have been muted. All guests have been unmuted.
Oops. Sorry, folks. We'll be dealing with...
I think we're good now, Gayle. Go ahead.
Okay. I hope everybody can hear me now. Sorry about that. It's the challenge with muting everybody. So getting back to our list here, as you can see, the list starts with the federal requirements, and those federal requirements of the Clean Water Act are translated into regulations, and then at the state level, the state has laws and then regulations, and they translate them into permits, and they are then translated into stormwater pollution prevention plans or stormwater management plans, which then sometimes have to be translated into local ordinances, and those ordinances we have to look to see what controls come out of them, and when we are looking for what actual best management practices on the ground are happening, we're looking at different ways that monitoring and inspection for compliance can happen. And then we have enforcement. So we really do have all these different levels, and it causes the program to be much more complicated in many ways than the basic NPDES wastewater program. I'm wondering if we can have the line muted again, and I'll unmute myself this time. Ryan.
All right, let's see if we can make this work this time.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? If everybody could raise their raise hand function. Okay, thanks everybody. You can unraise your hand. Sorry about that challenge. Okay. So what I do want to do, moving into the details of the stormwater program, really requires that and since some of us weren't on the line last week with the basic NPDES program, just the basic understanding that at the heart of the Clean Water Act is the primary objective of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our waters. And in that sense, stormwater permits are no different than NPDES wastewater permits that we've perhaps worked on for years. And we need and continue to push for a stronger attention to the need for chemical, physical, and biological recognition inside those permits and how strong the permits can be. The interim goals of the Clean Water Act also need to be part of the stormwater program, and I think for the most part are not always explicitly so. The waters that will be fishable and swimmable wherever attainable, waters must be fishable and swimmable wherever attainable, with a goal of 1983, an interim national goal. And I think that the details of that goal and the ways that it's implemented in the stormwater permits really has to be more explicit, with the agencies looking back to the water quality standards that protect the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and providing for recreation in and on the water. And to the extent that the stormwater permits can include that attention, we'll be getting closer to the strong permits that we need in place. Another piece of the important attention to stormwater is the goal that was the elimination of discharge of pollutants to surface water by 1985. While we know we haven't achieved that, in the case of stormwater, there's a lot of activity that many of you may be involved in regarding green infrastructure and focusing on infiltration. And in a lot of ways, infiltration of water, of stormwater on site, where possible, really gets toward that elimination of discharge of pollutants goal that was set in the Clean Water Act. So another important emphasis that we talked about last week with the webinar with Merit, and that many of you may know of, is the focus on the NPDES program, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. The permits are focused on point sources of discharge. And while stormwater has historically been discussed and considered non-point source, something that is not collected in a pipe and discharged, it is, in most cases, in almost all cases, it is a point source, and it is in some way conveyed through a discrete conveyance, a pipe, a ditch channel, as listed here from the specific Code of Federal Regulations at the federal level that talks about the point source discharge. And so as we think again about stormwater, they are point sources, and that is why they are regulated through this program. The exception, of course, is at the bottom here is not is the exception for return flows from irrigated agriculture. So in terms of point sources being controlled, they need to be controlled through permits, and all those different levels that we had looked at before, the permits then kick in these plans, which then kick in sometimes change of local ordinances, and all of those kick in what we have in place are best management practices. And what I think a lot of folks around the country are looking to do is a stronger connection between the requirements of the water quality standards in your state into the permits, the stormwater permits, and also on the other end where you have cleanup plans, putting them into the connection of the permit. Now, who's in charge of this? And I don't know if everybody's aware of this. This list is just decreasing, has decreased over time. EPA has the authority to do the NPDES, to be in charge of NPDES permitting in 4 states, D.C., territories, and most tribal land, but all other states have delegated authority to develop the stormwater programs and permits. So I'm going to see if folks will use their chat function here and name, who knows the 4 states, you can just use the initials abbreviated that are still regulated. The permits are still written by EPA for stormwater and other NPDES programs. Multiple attendees are typing. Yep, we've got some of them there. I'm going to let people keep trying. Yep, keep trying if you know 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. We've got a few examples there. All right. All right. Well, here they are. The list is Massachusetts, which several folks got, New Hampshire, Idaho, and New Mexico. And the District of Columbia, and I've got the flags of Guam and Puerto Rico up there, but there's the territories and most tribal land, and there's on the EPA website, there's a place where you can look up EPA Authority, and it's a good chart to help you see that opportunity and that necessity. And what's important about that is that if you are in any of those states, you are working directly with EPA, not your state agency, on these permits. And if you're in the other states, that you are working with your state agency to implement the Clean Water Act requirements, and EPA can play a role in terms of oversight as well. So I'm going to stop there for just a second and see if anybody has any questions based on just these opening thoughts before I dive into the 3 different topics we've got going here, the specifics. Anybody have any specific questions of the connection to the standards or authority at this point? They can come in as we go forward as well. So I'm not seeing anything, so we'll move on. What I want to cover here is the municipal, industrial, and construction, the construction programs separately, and we're going to try to tackle each one of them and some things that you can do if you have an interest in one of them in your watershed. And mainly what I want to point out is that as that list of ways to engage is so long, you really do need to figure out in your own scope of work, in your watershed, in your state, wherever you are working, what the right focus is for your organization or you as an individual. And is it focusing on the municipal program, and why would that be? Or do you have more industrial or commercial and elements that are regulated in your watershed, and perhaps that's the place because they're not doing a good job, or perhaps don't all have stormwater permits? Or is it that you're experiencing, and as we see the economy picking up, we'll be seeing more construction going on, and is it time to get things in place to really get a handle on the kinds of protections that your state and local governments have for construction? So as we go forward, I really want you to keep in mind that there's an exercise of focus that needs to be done, because no one organization or person can focus on all these pieces at once. So I'm just going to see if we're going to start with a couple. These are not, well, these can be for, why don't we do a chat response on these? And I'm not going to answer them. They're going to be questions that we're going to have going forward, but you'll be able to type in your answers to these few questions that will lead into our next section here. How often are stormwater permits supposed to be reviewed and renewed? And you can just type in the answer. I'm not going to answer these now, but we'll come up to them a little bit later, and then you can check your thoughts on this. And if you don't know the answer, it's okay. We'll get to them. A lot of people are answering that one. How often are stormwater permits reviewed and renewed? It's a little pre-quiz we've got here. Who knows what MS4 stands for? MS4. That's a specific one related to one of the categories that we're going to be talking about. Another question after you're done with that one, because that could be typing that's a few words to type. We've got a lot of people answering that one. How many industrial categories besides construction are there that are regulated? How many industrial categories? There's broader categories. It's the individual just SIC codes, but how many industrial categories besides construction are regulated? There's types of industrial activities is kind of what the way they characterize it. And then the last one, based on the federal requirements, at what size must a construction site obtain a stormwater permit? What is the federal requirement for what size? Sometimes states go a little bit lower, but the federal requirement for what size a construction site must obtain a stormwater permit. Okay, I'm going to let some folks keep typing, and then we'll move on in one sec. All right, so we'll get back to this. It's like our pre-quiz that we'll get back to some of the answers. Going into these three pieces, I'm not going to go to explain this whole diagram, and again, the PowerPoint will be available when the webinar goes online as well. But I want to emphasize the point as we go into it that there's an overlap between the circles of the three different programs. The MS4 ones are the municipal program, and that's divided into two pieces, Phase 1 and Phase 2, which we'll talk about. There's the construction requirements, and then there are industrial requirements, and there's overlap. That I'll come back to this diagram in a couple slides, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this. But I wanted to emphasize that there's overlap in these programs that we really need to be aware of. So the second question that I asked, what is MS4? I wonder if you folks got it right. Municipal Separated Storm Sewer Systems. Looks like a lot of people got it right. MS4s is one of the very well used acronyms in stormwater world. And the municipal separated storm sewer systems are used synonymously with municipalities, but it does include counties and townships. This list here also of entities which are often called non-traditional MS4s. They're not just cities, but they are entities, public entities that might have their own sewer system, separated storm sewer system that might either come into a city's system, or it might discharge on its own. And those entities are also supposed to be controlling stormwater and often have their own permit, or are more often connected to a neighboring municipal permit. They might be co-permittees in that sense. These lists of the municipal separated storm sewer systems are available on your state websites, and it's unbelievable how much easier things are to find. It is to find information these days on the stormwater program than 13 years ago, 14 years ago, when folks, we would need to really either dig into a website or call the agency directly to get printed copies of things. But now you can go on and get a list of the municipal separated storm sewer systems in any state quite easily. And the way that these entities are and have been defined has a census connection to it. So things do change after the census, and the states will readjust who is an MS4 and who is not. But it has, up to this point, been greater than 50,000 people in population with a density factor there. 1,000 people per square mile is usually part of this definition. While the 10 to 50,000 population segment of areas, either incorporated or not, can be evaluated or were to be considered to be evaluated in the 2003 rules. Many states opted not to do that evaluation and just kept them out. Some states delayed it and then thought they'd get to it, but for the most part, these states were pretty much overwhelmed with just dealing with the 50,000 population and up. So you might check to see if your state has addressed the section of 10 to 50,000, and what they would evaluate them for is whether or not they might have a particular reason, whether they're rapidly growing, or there's sensitive waters, or there's some particular pollutants or entities in that area that might be causing or contributing to significant stormwater contamination, or big areas of pavement that might be causing or contributing to stormwater volumes, for example. So there is an evaluation function that states can be pushed into or encouraged to take on. There's a lot of times where smaller entities that could even be 10,000 in population or smaller, where they are actually nearby a larger urban area that is regulated, and they are sometimes, oftentimes incorporated in that urbanized area and given the guidance of the larger entity to take on the regulatory requirements. So it's important to figure out what the list is in your watershed, and important to find out what ways that, if there are risks and threats, that they are being considered and asked to at least manage what they're doing in a protective way to the watersheds. I'll put a note out here. I think this is an important note in both municipal and construction programs. It's important to find out how your state is treating your departments of transportation. Sometimes they have their own MS4 permit, and increasingly that's the case. A lot of times they've been within another larger urban larger urban MS4 permit. So whether the departments of transportation are co-permittees or increasingly they have their own permit, it's important to find out because of how pervasive roads and the stormwater off-roads are in terms of our waterways. Now, the other thing to note here is that there are changes afoot. Many of you may have heard that EPA is discussing and has been working for some 3 years now on a new stormwater rule that will primarily focus on MS4s, on the municipal component of the program, but not entirely perhaps. And they have been discussing an expansion of this MS4 definition. And we'll talk a little bit later in our webinar here about what the current understanding is and the timing on those changes. So what happens when you are a municipal storm sewer system and you have a separated storm sewer system? What do you need to do? In the case of the larger cities, and those would be the ones that are large and medium, are considered over 100,000 people, and they were regulated back in the mid-90s, and cities of that size were required to pull together their program back in the mid-90s. Those are typically individual permits and typically have co-permittees, as I mentioned, that might be smaller neighboring towns and cities or counties. So it's important to find out how those large urbanized areas are including neighbors around. And sometimes they're watershed-based. So the primary example of watershed-based municipal MS4 permit is in Michigan, and that has faced challenges recently and is not likely to be continuing going forward. There are other states we've seen in Southern California where, in California in general, where the cities have focused on a large urbanized area and have required watershed-based activities to happen, or specific plans based on a watershed. San Diego, Ventura County, and LA are good examples of that if you want to look to see how they've done it without actually having a watershed-based permit. And the smaller area, the smaller entities, those 50,000, between 50,000 and 100,000 in population, came into the program in 2003. At that time, the larger and medium Phase 1 communities that you might have heard, the term Phase 1 and Phase 2, had been, were supposed to have been permitted and working on their stormwater management plans for more than 5 years, certainly, but sometimes some entities were in their second round of 5-year permits. When the small ones came in, a lot of the discussion was about not individual permits, but how they would be implemented in general permits. And the general permit versus individual permit plays out here most distinctively. And the general permit is when you have, it fits in not just in the stormwater context, it can also happen in wastewater activities. You see them in gravel mining, for example, and in confined feedlots. They're often, and most often, general permits. They're supposed to be a similar activity and similar problems and things that can be regulated in a permit that is covering a lot of different activities that are, again, supposed to be similar. This program was set up in the state would develop a general permit that would cover all of the entities between 50,000 and 100,000 in population. And as we know, there can be a lot of variation between an entity that's 50,000 to that one that's just under 100,000 in population. There can be difference between entities that are both 50,000 in population. So the general permit has faced a lot of bumps and challenges because the way the states develop these permits, it's hard to make it a cookie cutter for all the different cities. And there are times when even these smaller communities are asked or required to have an individual permit. An important point to note here is that these individual permits are, there is a process in the regulation where you or I or any watershed organization or individual can request that the city be evaluated for an individual permit for certain reasons. And those reasons in the regulations at the federal level are because they might have had compliance problems or because they might have had particular pollutants of concern that are not being addressed in the general permit. So there's specific rules for petitioning for an individual permit to be developed. I think no state nor EPA would want all the stormwater permits to turn to individual permits, but sometimes that's an important tool when you're facing challenges that can't be addressed in the general permit. So coming back to the relationship between the stormwater programs, it's a little easier now to talk about the three bigger circles here. We've divided the MS4 circle into two, the larger and medium cities in the first, or entities, cities, counties, and otherwise in the first upper half of the circle, and the smaller ones, those between 50,000 and 100 in the lower half of the circle. What is important to note here is as we move into the next section of our talk here on construction, these MS4s are required to take on and develop programs within their urbanized area that deal with construction and post-construction. That's the not just the construction phase of development. So what's happening after construction is over, and what's going on when in the developed, already existing developed world is part of the municipal separated storm sewer system world already. So there's an overlap, and we'll talk when we get to construction a little bit more about the coordination that needs to be happening. In the industrial component, however, that we'll talk about later in more detail, is only required with the larger and medium-sized cities and counties and entities that have an MS4 permit. So by that I mean an industrial facility that's in an urbanized area will need to get not only a permit that deals with their industrial wastewater discharge, stormwater discharge, but they will also be subject to whatever their city develops in terms of an industrial program. And there may sometimes be differences or additional requirements at the local level. There may sometimes be more requirements at the state level. So that, again, that coordination between what the state permit is and what the municipalities require of the industrial sites in their urbanized area is a really important coordination. I'm going to pause for a second. Are there any specific questions about that coordination piece? We can get into it a little bit more as we hit the other programs as well. But it's a philosophical point that I want to emphasize. Okay. For now, we'll move on. The municipal stormwater permits, again, are separated into this Phase 1 and Phase 2 categories. Some states, I have to say, this distinction is lessening, and some states are making the requirements from any city or county or entity over 50,000 in population to be the same all the way up through over 250,000, which is the larger category. But in the federal requirements, the large and medium Phase 1 stormwater, municipal stormwater entities had to identify major outfalls and pollutants. They had to detect and eliminate illicit discharges. That's where there might be a cross connection and there might be sewage or some other maybe industrial connection that goes into the stormwater and just gets dumped into the water body without treatment. They had to look at pollutants in the industrial, commercial, and residential areas that I was just mentioning. That's the overlap in the industrial program. They had to deal with construction, stormwater discharges from new development and redevelopment. They had to deal with construction and post-construction, but it was stated in this way, new development and redevelopment. And they also had monitoring and reporting that was an important part of their permit, at least on an annual basis. So what is required is at the top here is a management plan. So there's a permit that says, here's the things you have to do, and then the entity develops their management plan, and many of you may realize that these can be volumes. You can be buried in the paperwork of the management plans in a large city. And what they're telling us in that plan is how they are going to reduce the pollutants to the maximum extent practicable. MEP is an acronym that is used to describe what the standard is for what a city has to do in their stormwater plan and on the ground. And many of you may realize that this it may sound vague. It is vague, and there has been a lot of work in the court system to try to understand and figure out and push the entities to be more explicit about what they believe maximum extent practicable is for the best management practices that need to happen inside their boundaries, inside their jurisdiction. So, for example, is the maximum extent practicable something else that has already happened in their jurisdiction, or something else that has already been done as a best management practice somewhere else in the country, something that's already being done on a regular basis to control stormwater elsewhere in the country. And so there's a lot of wrangling in the courts about how to really understand and have some kind of bright lines for what is considered the maximum extent practicable. That's in the regulations, the federal regulations, and it's been taken to give a lot of flexibility at the municipal level. And there's a lot of folks who are trying to work that strategy, try to figure out ways to have the municipal entities pay stronger attention to the water quality standards that are in their receiving water bodies and how they are required to meet those water quality standards. So what I have just put in here is a couple examples, is an example of a Kentucky pollutant discharge elimination system permit for stormwater. It's an example of what you would see, and it looks in some way, some parts of it, very much like a regular wastewater discharge permit, and it will have, as you see here, there's several entities that are co-permittees, and lower down on the page you have when the permit's effective and when it will expire, and those are some of the basic elements that you'll see on the cover page. Within the permit, you will see, and we're not going to go through the elements of a whole permit here, but within the permit you will have the pieces that were listed up in that previous slide to list out how they're dealing with the mapping for outfalls of pollutants and how they're detecting and eliminating illicit discharges, and what are they doing to deal with the industrial, how are they developing an industrial program. So all of that will be in what the permit says they have to do, and then what we need to do as well is look at their plans, the plans that they develop to say how they are going to do those things. One of the things that's important and different about the larger Phase 1 communities is that they do have a monitoring component, and as I'll point out, a required monitoring component. Here in the Phase 2 element, we have, again, the requirement of a management plan that is required by these permits. For the smaller, again, these are the entities between 50,000 and 100,000 in population, and it may be smaller. So a lot of what we hear is, especially with regard to this part of the program, is we hear about unfunded mandates and the small communities and how they're too small. Maybe they just have one Department of Public Works person to do this. And so what was introduced in 2003 was this the first 6 elements here, 6 minimum measures: public education, public involvement, the eliminating illicit discharges, requiring erosion and sediment controls for construction, requiring best management practices for post-construction, and requiring pollution prevention for the entities holding the permit for their own good housekeeping. Those are 6 minimum measures that you may hear about, and they are, this permit system was much more structured in that way, and that's why some states have taken these 6 minimum measures and required them of the larger entities as well. Why I've put annual reporting here is that annual reporting is required at of the smaller entities. However, they are, I would say, perhaps it's fair to say, seldom required to do ambient water monitoring as larger and medium MS4s are required, and they are, while they are required to look at ways to set up the program so that it is strong, the program for construction, for example, or for post-construction, and a lot of time that requires some viewing after a storm and making sure that the best management practices are still in place. There's not that same requirement for regular monitoring that you see in the the NPDES program that deals with wastewater. We have, and you may remember Merritt was talking about this, the discharge monitoring reports that are required in the stormwater, not the stormwater, in the wastewater NPDES program they're monthly. The discharge monitoring reports are required monthly, and here, while we do have some states that are developing and requiring discharge monitoring reports for stormwater, it's less often the case, and it's not monthly. We've seen, where I've seen it, it's been more quarterly, and we'll see a little example of that a little later. But the annual reporting is another important piece of what we can review to see in this stepwise progression. How has the state translated the federal regulations and requirements into a permit that then is translated into a plan by the permittee that we then, perhaps if we choose to evaluate whether they're doing a good job, we then need to look at whether the best management practices are being put in place and whether they're working. The annual report sometimes is only checkboxes saying that they've started doing certain things, that they've provided a training program for construction operators, that they've held a public meeting for a given permit, or that they are reaching out to the public for decision making. So the annual report may or may not be that helpful, and there's ways you can encourage the state to make the requirements for annual reporting more helpful. So hopefully that is a good distinction between the Phase 1 and Phase 2. The Phase 2 being more regimented. The Phase 2 is also, the point I guess I need to emphasize also, is that this is a general permit in almost all cases, as I mentioned earlier. The Phase 1 entities are mostly individual permits that have specifics to that jurisdiction, and these Phase 2 communities are usually applying to be covered under a general permit that is issued at the state level for all of the entities within that 50 to 100,000 population range. So obviously there's lots of variation. What we have seen is that there are some places where the state, in the case of Michigan, has allowed, in 2003, allowed many municipalities or counties to come together in a watershed, to work together for stormwater management as co-permittees in a watershed permit. We have seen that in other places, in other parts of states, they might come up with a watershed focus for their stormwater controls, and I would encourage you all to think about that, as it is an important attention, especially if you get a watershed, if you're dealing with, as many of us are, watersheds that either have specific high quality needs or specific impairments that need to be addressed in stormwater. So if you're looking at an entity that the discharge from the stormwater system is going into a water body that has a plan written, or otherwise known as a total maximum daily load for sediment problems, then you want that MS4 permit to pay attention, any of the MS4 permits that might be going into that water body, to be paying attention to that, those controls and those specific requirements for what's supposed to be done to alleviate those problems in the TMDL. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later too. In this shot is an example of the Phase 2. Again, going to the website, you can find so much more information than you could ever find. In the state of Washington this summer, they issued 3 different types of permits, and some of them were going to kick in August and then be replaced next August. And so usually you can pull up these parts of the website and get a lot of information, including the old permit, the current draft permit. You can get links to technical information, and as you can see, there's many appendices that go along with these permits. They can tell you about, as I just mentioned, the total maximum daily load requirements, which we see some states dealing with. Often there's the forms that the different entities need to take to fill out, to apply. So we're seeing far more information being provided, and what we want to be looking for when we're reviewing these permits is several of these elements that I've got up now. Similar to the NPDES program for wastewater, the states will develop a fact sheet, and this fact sheet on a new stormwater permit will in more narrative form describe things that have changed in the permit, and it will describe specific elements that perhaps were controversial during the comment period, and it will focus on areas that are perhaps what changed the most. And it's always useful to look through the fact sheet, and sometimes it's just as long, if not longer, than the permit. Sometimes it's called the rationale sheet or the statement of basis, in case you see that. Different states have different ways to label their fact sheet. The draft permit will be available when the comment period comes up, and there's usually a lot of appendices. Again, it can be very overwhelming, so pick the appendices that you want to address. Sometimes they're a page or two, sometimes they're another 50 pages. The old permit, comparing the old permit with the draft permit is always an important piece to find out what has been changed. Oftentimes, if you call the agency, they'll be willing to tell you what's changed. And annual reports are what I mentioned earlier, where you can see what the entity was reporting every year over the 5 years of the permit period, the previous permit period. Find out, did they accomplish the things that they said they were going to do? Did all the boxes get checked, even if it's only that much detail? You can add information and comments into your comments about the draft permit to say things like more detail needs to be required in annual reports. The same with monitoring reports, especially with the larger cities. There's going to be specific, many cities actually have a whole monitoring plan, stormwater monitoring plan, that is overwhelming but very interesting. And you're not likely to see that in the smaller cities. If you have a larger city nearby, you can see what kinds of things might be in their monitoring requirements, in their monitoring plan, and perhaps make some of those suggestions in the general permit for the smaller cities, and get ideas from the larger cities. Even though it might not be required, you certainly can request additional details that can be incorporated into the permit if there's good reason, because of impairments, because of a TMDL, or because of a higher quality water that really needs to be protected. There often will be comments received on earlier drafts that will be available, and additional technical information. And don't hesitate to call the agency. They're the experts, and they can help you wade through a lot of this information. So a few points here on the MS4 program and things specifically that you can do. In the larger cities, I've mentioned some of this, recent annual report. Find out whether the cities actually have developed their own programs for these pieces they're supposed to have programs for. Is there an illicit connection program, and how does it work? Do they look at, what do they require of construction sites, and how have they coordinated with the state construction program? What have they required of commercial and industrial sites in their jurisdiction, in their boundaries? Encourage coordination with the Phase 2 communities. There's sometimes a lot more detail, a lot more technical expertise available in the larger cities, and they can often help the smaller Phase 2 communities do their job better, and you can be the conduit for that information. Coordinating with industrial permittees and construction permittees is really important to not make all these requirements onerous or make them less onerous of the permittees. And as many of us are working more and more on green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, where can green solutions play into any of the elements in the municipal program? It's something that we can really help. In the smaller cities, encouraging the small cities to work together. There's huge economies of scale when the cities work together for the public involvement and public education programs. Examples out there are again, in Michigan, the Clinton River Watershed Council and the Huron River Watershed Council have both developed programs where they actually get funded by the cities to do the education and outreach and involvement for the entities in their watersheds. So there's ways that watershed organizations and individuals can be very helpful to the cities in coordinating a watershed stormwater message. And also thinking about ways that citizen monitoring programs can incorporate stormwater in their programs and trying to help. Sometimes they can be windshield evaluations of best management practices and whether they're in place, and sometimes it can be more detailed in water monitoring. But find ways that you can help your municipalities do a better job and show the ways that the additional information about how the program is doing can help everybody improve the water bodies and the receiving waters. All MS4s, really looking at whether or not the best management practices are working. Many of us live in entities where stormwater utilities exist. Those are entities that are able to raise funds to run their stormwater program. Funding of the stormwater activities is a huge impediment to a good program. And some states and cities actually have regulatory impediments to setting up those utilities. So where that doesn't exist, or where it does exist, encouraging that establishment and supporting it where it happens. And then coming back to the idea of high quality waters, outstanding waters, and problems that are already in the water bodies, and how can the stormwater program better pay attention to the impairments. So with that, I'm going to, there's just a couple things in the news here that we've seen, and I'll hold for a couple questions here on the municipal piece. But some of you may have noticed that last week the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments on 2 stormwater cases. In the case of the Los Angeles Flood Control District versus Natural Resources Defense Council, it was focused on the oral arguments were focused on whether the MS4 permit was what the wording for monitoring was, and whether or not one part of the system could be liable for discharge of stormwater from other entities that were all co-permittees. So that has not been decided, but it was a very interesting. You can look up more information about that. But looking at this idea of whether or not the MS4 permits are precise enough and are really clear about who's liable if there's discharge, or if it is so vague that no one is liable. And that was kind of where the discussion went last week. And it really is an important piece to pay attention to, and how we make permits more specific and more clear is part of what we can improve. Another piece that's in the news, as I mentioned, EPA is in the process and has been for about 3 years of drafting new stormwater rules. These rules will affect every municipal program in the country. They're focused on the MS4 program, but it may not be administered through it. There may be rules that are administered within and outside of the MS4 permits. They haven't said which they've decided on, but on the table are expansion of who and what's regulated beyond these urbanized areas, watersheds and connected entities and things like that are on the table. A specific performance standard for retention of water on site, and also an attention to how do we look back at the existing development that's already in our municipal areas, and how do we retrofit to deal with stormwater that's flowing over the impervious areas, the rooftops and the roads and the sidewalks that are already in our developed areas, and it's not clear how that's going to come out. So keep posted. June of 2013 is when we're now expected to see a draft of those changes, and a lot of entities did, in fact, a lot of municipalities did, in fact, delay what they were planning to do for their municipal permit because they were expecting EPA to come out with their final recommendations and requirements last year, and that didn't happen this fall. They were supposed to be finalized, but they haven't been. So with that, I'm going to just open up for some questions on the municipal part of the program, and I see a question here wondering if we can go back and show the what you can do slides again. These slides will all be available on the website within days, certainly within the week, and I encourage you to download it. And if you want it more quickly than that, you can, by all means, email me. I'll have my information at the end of the presentation, and you can email me, and I can get it to you faster if you're in the middle of a oh, I do see that there's something bleeding through. If you're in the middle of an urgent problem, I'm happy to send you some of these slides more quickly than they get up. Ryan, I wonder if we can do the little trick here again where we shut off.
Yeah, we'll give it a shot. You'll probably need to
okay,
unmute yourself again.
Okay, thanks.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Okay, hopefully everybody can still hear me. So any other questions on the municipal piece? I know this is a lot and trying to cover a lot in a short time, but I want to move on to industrial, and we'll see how these all fit together. The municipal piece really has taken a lot of people's attention lately, especially with regard to green infrastructure, but I don't want to, I want to make sure that I emphasize the importance of industrial stormwater pollution permits and requirements as well as the construction program, because there's a lot of ways that we can engage in these programs, perhaps even more easily sometimes than the municipal programs. In the industrial stormwater program, in fact, the construction element that is a whole other program is part of it. So this was one of our questions earlier: how many categories of activities are included are regulated under the industrial stormwater program? And there are actually 11 industrial categories. One of them being construction is a separate permit. So under this industrial stormwater program, 10 categories are regulated. And what's an important point about this, I've got examples here: manufacturing, landfills, salvage yards are some examples. It can be very light industrial, and as well as it's not just heavy manufacturing. And I encourage you to go to your state website on this, or EPA's list of all the different detailed elements of the 11 categories. When this permit was set up, there were certain standard industrial codes that were included and certain ones that weren't. And there is advocacy going on, and has been going on for years, to try to include more of the industrial and light industrial activities that were not included in those categories. There really was a limitation, and there's discussion back at the time that the regulations were passed in the 90s about what was included and what wasn't. So one important piece to look into in this is what and how your state covers these categories. The categories themselves can be included all in one general permit, and in that case they're often called multi-sector general permits. So some states only have that general permit, and it has ways you can tailor it sort of to the different activities that can be as different as a landfill or a salvage yard. And then there's other states that actually have several separate industrial stormwater permits that more specifically identify the common activities, the similar activities as is really dictated by the federal requirements of general permits. So that would be one big criticism of stormwater, of the industrial stormwater permitting, is that oftentimes there are far too many categories and different types of categories included in one general permit that really once an entity applies to be included under that permit, they are included, and it's not nearly the kind of review as if they were an individual permit and you could identify specific things that they are doing. So that gets to the no exposure certification here, which is an important, interesting, and critical piece to understand this program. In a lot of states, the no exposure certification is really where the industrial, the folks that have industrial activities go to first. They will look to see if they fit the categories, if they fit the case of no exposure. I'm going to flip forward and then I'll come back a couple places. This is from the State of Washington website, and it's this is where they allow you to pull out an application for, they call it a conditional no exposure certificate. But this set of questions, the 1 through 11, is a good example of what kinds of questions you should ask before an entity should be allowed to fill out what is usually a brief, maybe one side or two sides of one page application to be exempted from the industrial permit. Because all what Washington State is saying is if you answer yes to any of these questions, you are not eligible for the exemption. And unfortunately, most states do not have this kind of a list, though they have access to it. And it's this comes from EPA guidance as well. But if you see some of these things, are there materials or products from past industrial activity that are exposed to rain or snow? Is question number 3. The main thing that the state is looking for is, are there ways that exposure to rain or snow will result in contaminants running into the water body? And even when, so if an entity fills out this sheet that is not these questions, but the one pager that is usually quite short, that says, we certify that we do not have anything out that will be exposed to rain or snow that will go into a water body, something to that effect. There aren't too many states that actually require on-site inspection of that application before granting that no exposure exclusion. So what Washington State has done here is a good step in that direction, is making sure that people understand if you have any of these things, it's less likely, and you're not going to be eligible for this exclusion. And it also has some conditions about how it is a conditional exemption, and that if there's a change of facility, they have to apply again, and it needs to be either apply for a permit or apply again for a different exposure certificate, a non-exposure certificate. So that is something that's important about the industrial program, is the no exposure certification. Now, what is issued, again, is I was mentioning it's a general permit in most cases. You can also apply, as I mentioned in the municipal case, you can apply or petition for an entity to be required to get an individual permit. Usually the industrial stormwater requirements are folded into any wastewater permit that exists. So if there's a wastewater NPDES program for the facility and they're already dealing with that, usually there will be a section developed that's on stormwater and stormwater requirements that's getting more and more specific than it used to in years ago. But But if they don't have their own NPDES wastewater discharge permit, they have these options of you going in for a general, or they can choose to go in for an individual, but usually the individual permit would be forced by someone petitioning that an entity needed their own stormwater individual permit. And now what's required of that permit, again, similar to the other program, is a management plan, and there's elements in the state permit, be it general or individual, that will require what's in that management plan. And it is basically focused on what best management practices and what controls have to be put in place to prohibit or prevent contact of dangerous materials with the water bodies. And I wrote here, may not be submitted. Oftentimes it is not going to be submitted to the state. So that's another place where it has to be held on site at least, but there's a lot of places where our advocacy can encourage the state to say that they have to submit these plans to the state for some kind of review to make sure that they're doing what they need to be doing. But as those plans are developed and what is in those plans, those are the kinds of things that we can review and to see if there is the attention. In this case, industrial stormwater is required at the end of pipe. There's not the maximum extent practicable standard in place, so industrial stormwater is required at the end of pipe to meet water quality standards. So we have a much stronger standard, stronger standard in industrial and construction stormwater for the connection to water quality standards in the receiving water body. So that's an important piece that we need to highlight. The stormwater industrial general stormwater permits can often, look the same as the other industrial permits. Here's another piece of information that you might find on your stormwater permit. It talks about the different forms that are and when they're due and how often they're due. And here is an example of a discharge monitoring report on the 5th category down is due every quarter. So here the folks who get this general permit in the state of Washington for industrial facilities would have to submit some kind of a discharge monitoring report once a quarter. Their annual report once a year. And again, here's an example, the SWIP SWPPP Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, if requested, has to be provided within the 14 days of request, but it's not necessarily at the agency. And then there's non-compliant notification. So these kinds of things are listed on the state websites or in the state permits, and they're things to look out for as you're reviewing. The same list of things to review. There are fact sheets developed for these industrial permits, draft permits with appendices, try to figure out ways to compare with the old permit, annual reports for the facilities you're concerned about. There's definitely monitoring involved in industrial stormwater, so where the procedure for monitoring and the reports themselves are things that you can look at, and again, comments on earlier drafts that can be looked at. And don't hesitate to call your state agency person to try to wade through these things. Here's what you can do. Again, it's kind of dense here. I apologize. But covering over, looking whether or not the industrial, we've touched on some of this, whether the industrial general permit adequately covers all the industries you care about. Reviewing the stormwater management plans and implementation. And when you're involved in monitoring programs, monitor at the bottom at their outfalls when possible. There's an example here in Oregon where the Northwest Environmental Defense Center was out in kayaks years ago and were taking samples at industrial sites out in the port, and they found that certain entities weren't even permitted. And they fundamentally changed the industrial stormwater permit by being out in kayaks and taking samples. So be careful, but those kinds of things can really make a difference. Reviewing no exposure certifications can make a big difference, and particular industries might be easier to look at. Salvage yards, there's examples of how salvage yards have been brought into compliance because they're often mom and pop entities and they need your help perhaps, to understand what it's supposed to do, and oftentimes they might not even have a permit. So again, these kinds of ideas, we mentioned the coordination between industrial and Phase 1 entities and paying attention to high quality, outstanding waters, and where waters are, discharges might cause or contribute to problems that are already going on are really important. So I'm going to pause for a second. In the news here, again, there's another U.S. Supreme Court situation last week that was addressing whether logging roads would be subject to industrial stormwater permits, and that had been required in the Ninth Circuit and was being challenged. So reviewing the Court of Appeals decision, the agency's previous activities of exempting logging roads from permit requirements was again put on the table, and that decision was not made, and some things related to an EPA set of rules that came out right before the court case happened last week, right before the oral arguments happened last week, has kind of thrown this up in the air, but it's something to look into for a good example. Any specific industrial questions before I move on to our last topic of construction here? Okay, well, I'm going to plug away then. Sarah's typing. I'm going to wait for her question, but I'll put up this next slide. As we move into the construction, when I see what Sarah has typed, I'll go back to that. But just to, the definition of waters of the U.S. That is unfortunately a webinar in and of itself, and the main focus is that there's a lot of discussion federally and at the state levels about specific definitions of waters of the U.S. Each state has its own definition of waters of the state, and EPA has a definition of waters of the U.S. I encourage you to look it up on the EPA website, but it is essentially waters that the waters of the U.S. are what is regulated by these programs. And the idea of what waters fall into that category has been challenged over the last bunch of years in court cases, specifically related to the wetlands and the dredge and fill laws. So I'm going to encourage you to go to the website, and we can talk offline a little bit more about that definition. So with the time remaining, I'm going to focus on construction stormwater, and this program is, I think, one of the ones that watershed organizations and we as individuals can often be more engaged in, because how many folks on your way to work saw some kind of water flowing off of a construction site or off of a sidewalk with dirt on it and flowing into the storm drain? It's something we see every day, and I, riding my bike in today, saw oil and grease being carried into the storm drain as well. Of course, here in Portland it rains a lot. So in the construction stormwater program, it's really a focus on the active construction while it's going on, and therefore it's a temporary permit. So the difference between this program and the other two is that that when an entity is required to apply for these permits, they are required to apply and then also required to apply for the termination of that permit at the end. At the beginning, they have to apply for coverage, and at the end, they apply for termination, and there's a limited time. Who needs these permits? As I have here, anyone, this is another answer to one of our quizzes, anyone who's responsible for earth disturbance of 1 acre or greater. Some states have taken that threshold down a little bit lower in the state translation of the program, but this is the federal level requirements. And smaller parcels are also required to get a permit if they're part of a greater common plan. And that may mean that someone who's developing a subdivision, and they're doing it in phases, and one phase is only 1 acre, but But if you add all 4 phases, then they're talking about 10 acres or something like that. So it's really important to make the case for smaller parcels. They're part of a greater common plan needing to have and apply for coverage under the construction stormwater program. Now I've got some language here about unless a waiver applies, which I'll encourage you to look into, but most states allow for this waiver, and it is a federal waiver that is in the federal regulations. So people can get out of it, but there are equivalent, they have to demonstrate several things. And so if someone says that they're applying for a waiver because they have less rainfall, or they're in a semi-arid area, or somehow the controls are not necessary because a TMDL is in place, I would really encourage you to look into the documentation they've provided and make sure that that they've done their due diligence and that it's a truthful application of a waiver, because it is legal. The waivers are legal, but they need to have a process. And for the most part, anything over 1 acre, it should have a construction stormwater permit. And who issues the permits? The state does, unless, as I mentioned earlier, unless the state is New Mexico, Idaho, Massachusetts, or New Hampshire, where EPA in those cases issue the construction general permit. And sometimes some states define a qualifying local program to administer this program, and they will, in that case, it might be a county that already has been doing sedimentation and erosion control for years and years when these programs came into place. And in that case, the local program, the county, is given the authority by the state, and the state was given the authority by the federal regulations to issue the permits and to develop the program for enforcement and compliance. Now, at all levels, the state is still responsible for whether or not the permits that the qualifying local program might be issuing, whether or not they're in compliance and whether or not their programs are strong enough. So you still, though you have made a few steps perhaps, if you have a state that has qualifying local programs, you still have ways that the state or the EPA can get involved if you're not seeing strong programs and you're not seeing responsiveness to strengthening them. What do these programs look like? What's typically issued? It's a general permit, though an individual permit can be applied for or can be petitioned. These programs are, by and large, general permits. And again, I just would point out, general permit program is supposed to be for several common activities that are similar, and how they can be required to do certain things the same because they are similar. I'm sure that we can all come up with lots of different types of construction sites that may not really belong under the same permit. So that is something really to point out, and in cases where you feel a construction site is worthy of a lot more attention, that's the case where I would encourage you to apply for petition for an individual permit for that entity. What the general permit requires is that they file a notice of intent to be covered under the general permit, and then when they're done, they have to file a notice of termination. And sometimes we've found that construction sites are done and the developer has moved on and they never filed the notice of termination. You'd think that they'd want to terminate their liability for the project, but the notice of termination usually requires certain levels of stabilization, and if they don't go through that process, and especially as we've seen in the recent, last 5 to 7 years of the downturn, we have seen so many abandoned sites and so many states, and not enough programs have been developed to try to figure out, take into account where abandoned sites are contributing significantly to stormwater pollution, sediment, and contaminants with that sediment. So it's a big problem out there since the concerns about the downturn and abandoned sites. So something to keep in mind. I've just pointed out here that there can be watershed-based permits for construction where one watershed that has a particular attention, be it for specific water quality protections or TMDLs, like the Big Darby or the Olentangy in Ohio, they have specific requirements that are more focused on their watershed than the broader state program. And that, in that sense, that those permits have been they've been targeted at watershed level, and I encourage you all to take that on where you can. So here I'm just going to go through this because we're rounding out the end here, and I'm bumping up at the end of the half hour and wanting to get you all to your next things you're doing. But what is required, talk a little bit about these kinds of things. The Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan is similar in this program as in the others. It has to be on-site. It's seldom submitted to the agency, and oftentimes, because it's seldom submitted before a notice of intent is granted for coverage. So one of the big changes that we've tried to push for in state programs is how plans need to come in and how there need to be a certain number of days that are allowed, say 2 weeks before permit coverage is granted, because otherwise there's, in many states, automatic permit coverage once the application comes in, the notice of intent, and there's not sufficient, if any, review of the stormwater management plan. So how do they know what's going on these sites? Other things that may be required would be posting information at the site, specific BMPs in place. Sometimes, and more often than, well, I would say increasingly, states are starting to require some kind of attention to post-construction controls, because we know that the things that go on while the construction site is happening, and at the beginning, thoughtful consideration to what controls will be in place after the site is built. If it's done ahead of time, it's much better than going back and retrofitting. So increasingly, states are encouraging attention to post-construction during the program, during the development of the site. And there are a handful, about 10 or 11 states that actually require some attention to long-term maintenance and agreements that would pay attention to and have liability assigned to the site as it's passed on for stormwater management. Otherwise, it falls in the hands of a municipality, and if they're in an urbanized area. If they're not in an urbanized area, it falls on no one, and it's missed. So that's why the construction program can really make a difference. So here we have monitoring and irregular agency inspections that are often complaint-driven. And I'm going to move on because I want to be able to wrap up here. We've got a few questions to answer real quickly. I have some screenshots, but basically I would encourage you to go to your state. They have very thorough websites on stormwater and the permits that are in place and when you can comment on them, and you can look through the forms, and I would encourage you to do that. What you can do for the construction program is inspecting sites regularly, and I've seen such improvement in stormwater management at construction sites by programs that some of you may know about, including in Georgia, there was one that was called Get the Dirt Out. Now several states in the Southeast have a Muddy Water Watch, which also happened in Oregon, and citizen programs that pay attention to and inform the agency of stormwater-related erosion off of construction sites has really made a difference. Asking your municipality and your county to coordinate with the state construction permits, so where you have the MS4 requirements, try not to make two hugely different things happening with the state and the county, and try to encourage that coordination. And again, thinking about Department of Transportation in construction phase is another concern, and insisting on specific limits where high quality, outstanding waters and causing and contributing to problems where a TMDL is already in place. So I'm going to take just a couple questions here, and I apologize I'm over by a couple minutes here. The construction program allows, yes, sometimes for bonds, but the state, if you see it, the state is putting it into its permit, and it would say that it might require surety bonds in the permit. I would encourage, and there is definitely precedent for that, to encourage those kinds of things. If it isn't currently in the permit, it can be something that you advocate for. And the same thing for cleanup and termination. The main thing you want for the termination is that you want to have requirements in place that the entity, in order to get out of its permit at the end of the construction phase, you want to make sure that those stabilization requirements are, and the liability of what might happen at that site if it's not stable is clear. And those are the kinds of things you want to look for in the notice of intent, where they ask for coverage, and the notice of termination is where some of those specifics will come up. Posting on site, Ron is asking, like a building permit sign. Yes, we have seen groups have success. Oops, is the volume gone? Please raise your hand if you can still hear me. Okay, some people can still hear me. I'm sorry, Tim, I don't know how you, volume seems okay for some. So there is posting on site required. We have seen this in a successful way done by advocates who have required, who have gotten the requirement that the name of the entity doing the construction, the number of the permit, where the plan is, and how it can be accessed, because as you might know, you might not be that welcome on site at the construction building, but there is precedent for ways that signage can be, it's kind of like a right to know. If this pollution that's coming off this site is going into your water body, the information about how to find out more information about what's required of this site should be available. So yes, I totally encourage that. A quickie and in the news is that you may have heard a couple years ago, EPA had put out a limit, a specific numeric limit of for sediment that was then stayed. In other words, it was removed or withdrawn because of challenges. And supposedly the EPA was in the process of developing another, though we don't see any signs of another numeric standard coming out anytime soon. So where we do see that there are some states that have numeric sediment limits in their permits, and that is something that we need to move towards so that we have brighter lines and not just about the best management practices, which we can't be sure, and it's harder to say whether or not they're causing or contributing to water quality violations. Similar to the industrial permit, though, it's important to note the construction program is required to meet water quality standards. It is not just about maximum extent practicable. They are required to meet water quality standards. So I'm just going to leave on this common inadequacies that I've touched on, but are really, really important. If any of you have worked with the water quality standards in your state, there generally is very little or inadequate anti-degradation review associated with stormwater permits. And what we are seeing, where we see anything, Kentucky has fought this battle over and over again. We've seen some improvement with the state of Wisconsin, but we really don't see ways that as permits are coming in that they're being reviewed for problems that may be caused, especially in the case of construction sites where it's a new discharge, and how it might cause problems with high quality or outstanding waters is just taken into account the way it needs to be. Anti-degradation review kicks in when there's a new or expanded discharge. So keep that in mind. There's no prohibition or inadequate prohibition of causing or contributing to exceedances, because especially in the case of the general permits, there's no good way when an application comes in to force that, to say, tell us how you're going to prevent any new sediment that's going into this water body, or tell us how you're going to prevent high volume waters which are going to harm the habitat further in the downstream waters. There's inadequate connection to total maximum daily loads, where the stormwater specific contributions need to be highlighted. And the general permit in and of itself causes a lot of these challenges I've just mentioned. So where you can focus the state's attention on a particular site you're concerned about and have them direct it towards an individual permit, I would encourage it. So with that, I've tried to cover a whole bunch, and here's resources, and I would encourage you to go to, and I apologize for the rushing and going over at the end here, but EPA website, I'll leave this up, state websites, go to your website at your state level and you'll find so much information. Our online course goes into this in greater detail, as does our owner's manual, and the owner's manual is now available fully online. And by all means, send additional questions my way, because I'm happy to follow up with any one of you on specific questions. And I apologize for trying to jam so much in, and appreciate your patience, and hope that this has at least given you some direction for questions and ways that you might be able to improve your work on your stormwater programs. Stick around, there will be a evaluation coming up, and I encourage you to look for the slides on our website in a few days.